The sun bore down mercilessly on Willow Creek as Melissa Jones struggled against her father's iron grip, her pristine white dress billowing around her ankles like a desperate flag of surrender. She dug her heels into the dusty main street, her chestnut hair falling from its careful arrangement as she fought against the fate being forced upon her. "Father, please, I don't love him." Melissa's voice cracked with desperation as she was dragged toward the small, whitewashed church at the edge of town, where Reverend Thompson waited with a Bible in his weathered hands, and Clarence Rutherford, the town's wealthiest landowner, stood smugly in his finest suit. Townsfolk lined the street, watching with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity as 18-year-old Melissa was pulled inexorably toward a marriage she'd never agreed to. Her father, Edmund Jones, the owner of Willow Creek's only hotel, had arranged the match to settle his gambling debts to Rutherford, a man nearly 30 years Melissa's senior. "You'll learn to appreciate what I've done for you," Edmund hissed, tightening his grip on her wrist. "Rutherford can provide for you. What more could you want?" Tears streamed down Melissa's face as the church steps loomed before her. The year was 1876, and in this corner of Wyoming territory, a woman had few rights and fewer choices. The wedding guests had already filed inside, the piano beginning the somber notes of a wedding march that felt more like a funeral dirge to Melissa's ears. "I won't do it," she whispered, knowing her protests were futile. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, leaving her with no allies against her father's increasingly desperate schemes. Just as Edmund dragged her up the first step, the church doors burst open. Silhouetted against the dim interior stood a tall figure, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. The sun glinted off the star pinned to his vest as he stepped forward, revealing a face weathered by sun and hardship, yet handsome beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Not today," the cowboy said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of thunder across the suddenly silent street. Edmund froze, his grip momentarily slackening. "Jackson Prescott, this is none of your business." The cowboy Jackson descended the steps slowly, his spurs jingling with each deliberate movement. "When you drag a woman to the altar against her will in my town, it becomes my business, Edmund." Melissa's heart hammered in her chest as she recognized the man. Jackson Prescott had become the town's sheriff just 6 months ago, arriving from somewhere back east with little explanation and fewer words. He kept to himself mostly, but maintained order with a firm but fair hand that had earned him respect throughout Willow Creek. "She's my daughter," Edmund sputtered, "and I'll do with her as I please." Jackson's hand rested casually on his holstered Colt. "The law says different. A woman's got the right to choose her own husband, even out here." Clarence Rutherford emerged from the church, his face mottled with rage. "I paid good money for this wedding, Prescott. You're interfering with a business transaction." "People aren't property to be bought and sold," Jackson replied, his blue eyes narrowing. "Not in this country, not anymore." Melissa found her voice at last. "I never agreed to this marriage, Sheriff. Please help me." Edmund yanked her arm hard enough to make her cry out. "You ungrateful!" Before he could finish, Jackson had closed the distance between them. With one swift movement, he twisted Edmund's wrist until he released Melissa, then positioned himself between father and daughter. "Miss Jones, would you like to press charges against your father for assault?" Jackson asked, never taking his eyes off Edmund. Melissa hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but I won't marry Mr. Rutherford either." Rutherford stepped forward menacingly. "You'll regret this, Sheriff. I own half this town, and I uphold the law in all of it," Jackson replied evenly. "Go home, Clarence. The wedding's off." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Reverend Thompson, looking relieved, quietly closed his Bible and retreated into the church. Edmund, nursing his wrist, glared at his daughter. "Don't come home. You're dead to me." The words stung, but Melissa lifted her chin. "I understand, Father." As Edmund stalked away, followed by a fuming Rutherford, Melissa suddenly realized the precariousness of her situation. She had nowhere to go and nothing but the dress she stood in. Jackson seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Wallace at the boarding house has a spare room. She owes me a favor." You can stay there until you figure out your next steps." Melissa looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. His eyes were a startling blue against his tanned skin, and though his expression remained guarded, there was kindness there. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when people are forced into lives they didn't choose." He offered his arm. "May I escort you to the boarding house, Miss Jones?" As they walked through town, Melissa felt the weight of stares following them. Her almost wedding would be the talk of Willow Creek for weeks to come. But for the first time in years, she felt something that had become foreign to her: hope. Mrs. Wallace, a kindly widow in her 50s, welcomed Melissa without questions, showing her to a small but clean room at the back of the boarding house. "Sheriff Prescott explained the situation," Mrs. Wallace said. "Don't you worry about payment just yet. We'll figure something out." Before leaving, Jackson awkwardly removed his hat. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Miss Jones. Lock your door tonight." Melissa caught his sleeve. "Thank you, Sheriff. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No need for repayment, just making sure justice is done." After he left, Melissa sat on the narrow bed, her wedding dress pooling around her. The events of the day washed over her, and she began to shake with delayed shock. She had defied her father, lost her home, and escaped a loveless marriage all in the span of an hour, and a mysterious sheriff with sad eyes had made it possible. The next morning, Melissa awoke to find a package outside her door. Inside was a simple blue dress, modest but well-made, along with a note in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Thought you might want something different to wear. JP." The gesture brought tears to her eyes. She changed quickly and went downstairs, where Mrs. Wallace was preparing breakfast. "Sheriff Prescott asked me to tell you he's arranged a position for you at the schoolhouse," Mrs. Wallace said, placing a plate of eggs before Melissa. "Miss Andrews has been looking for an assistant teacher. It's not much pay, but it would cover your room and board here." Melissa could hardly believe her luck. She had completed 2 years at a ladies' seminary in Denver before her mother's death forced her to return home. Teaching had always been her dream. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed. "When do I start?" "Today, if you're willing," came a deep voice from the doorway. Jackson stood there, hat in hand. He looked different in the morning light, less intimidating, more human. "I would be delighted," Melissa replied, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance. He nodded. "I'll walk you over after breakfast. Town's still buzzing about yesterday. Best you not go alone for a while." On their walk to the schoolhouse, Melissa gathered her courage. "Sheriff, may I ask where you're from? You don't seem like most of the lawmen out here." Jackson was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Pennsylvania originally, spent some time in Boston, came west after the war." "The Civil War, you fought Union cavalry," he said shortly. "Not something I care to dwell on." Melissa sensed there was more to his story, but his tone discouraged further questions. They continued in comfortable silence until reaching the schoolhouse, where Miss Andrews, a stern but fair woman in her 30s, welcomed Melissa warmly. Over the next few weeks, Melissa settled into a routine. She assisted with lessons during the day, took her meals at the boarding house, and gradually began rebuilding her life. Jackson checked on her regularly, always maintaining a professional distance that nonetheless felt protective. She learned bits about him from town gossip. He had arrived in Willow Creek with an impressive recommendation from a federal marshal. He lived simply in rooms above the sheriff's office, rarely drank, never gambled, and had turned down numerous dinner invitations from eligible young women. Some said he had lost a wife and child back east, but no one knew for certain. One afternoon in late September, Melissa was walking back from the schoolhouse when she noticed a group of men gathered outside the saloon. Among them was Clarence Rutherford, clearly intoxicated and growing belligerent. She tried to cross to the other side of the street, but Rutherford spotted her. "There she is," he slurred loudly. "The ungrateful little tease who humiliated me in front of the whole town." Melissa quickened her pace, heart pounding. "Don't you walk away from me, girl." Rutherford shouted, staggering after her. "You cost me good money. Your father skipped town without paying me back. Edmund had left Willow Creek shortly after the wedding fiasco, reportedly heading to California. Melissa hadn't heard from him since. Rutherford caught up to her, grabbing her arm roughly. The smell of whiskey on his breath made her stomach turn. "Let go of me, Mr. Rutherford," she said firmly, despite her fear. "Or what?" he sneered, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. The unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked cut through the tension. "Or I'll be forced to arrest you for assault," Jackson said, appearing as if from nowhere. "Let her go, now." Rutherford released Melissa, but his eyes burned with hatred. "You can't protect her forever, Prescott." "Try me," Jackson replied, his voice deadly quiet. The standoff lasted several heartbeats before Rutherford backed down, muttering curses as he returned to the saloon. Jackson holstered his weapon. "Are you all right, Miss Jones?" Melissa nodded, rubbing her arm where bruises were already forming. "Yes, thank you again. I'm concerned about Rutherford," Jackson said, frowning. "He's been drinking heavily since the wedding that wasn't, and he's making threats." "What should I do?" Melissa asked. Jackson considered for a moment. "For now, don't go anywhere alone. I'll keep an eye on him." That evening at dinner, Mrs. Wallace announced that her sister in Denver had fallen ill, and she would be leaving to care for her for several weeks. "Sheriff Prescott has agreed to check on the boarding house regularly," she assured Melissa. "And Mr. Peterson from the general store will stay here nights until I return," but fate had other plans. The very next day, Mr. Peterson injured his back unloading supplies and was confined to bed. Mrs. Wallace, already on the stagecoach to Denver, couldn't be recalled. Jackson came to the boarding house that evening, clearly troubled. "I don't like leaving you here alone, Miss Jones." "I'll be fine," Melissa insisted, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Rutherford's been making more threats today, drunk talk mostly, but I don't trust him." Jackson paced the small parlor. "I could ask one of the married ladies in town to stay with you, but on such short notice." Melissa twisted her hands in her lap. "What do you suggest?" Jackson stopped pacing, looking uncomfortable. "I could stay here, in the parlor," he added quickly. "Just until we find a more suitable arrangement." Propriety dictated she refuse, but fear won out. "That would be acceptable, thank you." That night, Melissa lay awake listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards below as Jackson moved about. His presence both comforted and unsettled her. She had never spent a night under the same roof with a man who wasn't family, yet somehow it felt right that it was Jackson keeping watch. In the morning, she found him making coffee in the kitchen, his hair damp from washing, his usual stern expression softened by fatigue. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Enough," he replied, pouring her a cup. "I need to make my rounds, but I'll be back this evening." This arrangement continued for 3 days, falling into a surprising domesticity. Melissa would return from teaching to find Jackson had brought dinner from the hotel restaurant. They would eat together, talking cautiously at first, then with growing ease. She learned he had studied law before the war, that he had a younger sister in Philadelphia, that he preferred coffee to tea and could name every constellation in the night sky. He never spoke of why he had come west or what demons seemed to haunt him, and she didn't press. On the 4th evening, a terrible thunderstorm rolled in. The schoolhouse closed early, and Melissa hurried back to the boarding house through the first heavy drops. She was soaked by the time she arrived, rushing inside to find Jackson already there, building up the fire. "You're drenched," he observed, concern evident in his voice. "You should change before you catch cold." Melissa nodded, hurrying upstairs to her room. She changed into her only other dress, a simple brown calico, and was attempting to dry her hair when a tremendous crash shook the house. She rushed downstairs to find part of the kitchen ceiling had collapsed under the weight of rain-soaked timber. Water poured in, quickly flooding the floor. "Are you all right?" Jackson called from where he was attempting to move furniture away from the deluge. "Yes, what happened?" "The roof's been needing repairs for months," he explained, grunting as he pushed the heavy dining table. "Mrs. Wallace mentioned it before she left. We need to cover this before the whole ceiling comes down." Together they worked to place buckets under the worst leaks and cover the furniture with sheets. The storm intensified, lightning flashing through the windows and thunder shaking the foundations. As they worked side by side, Melissa became acutely aware of Jackson, the strength in his arms as he lifted heavy objects. The clean scent of him beneath the smell of rain and damp wood, the way his usually guarded eyes softened when they met hers. When they had done all they could, they stood in the parlor, both partially soaked and breathing heavily from their efforts. "Thank you," Melissa said, suddenly shy. "I couldn't have managed alone." Jackson's eyes traveled over her face, lingering on her lips before he quickly looked away. "Just doing my job, Miss Jones." "Melissa," she said quietly. "After all this, I think you might call me Melissa." He met her gaze again, something unreadable in his expression. "Melissa," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name, "then I suppose you should call me Jackson." The intimacy of the moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Another crash of thunder broke the spell and Jackson stepped back. "The kitchen's unusable," he said, all business again, "and that leak is spreading. We should go to the hotel for the night." Melissa's eyes widened. "But separate rooms," he assured her. "But this house isn't safe tonight." As they hurried through the downpour to the hotel, Melissa couldn't help but wonder what the townspeople would think, seeing them arrive together in such a state. But the streets were deserted, everyone having sought shelter from the storm. The hotel clerk raised an eyebrow at their appearance but asked no questions as Jackson requested 2 rooms. Unfortunately, due to a cattle buyers' convention, only 1 room was available. "It has 2 beds," the clerk offered, not quite meeting their eyes. Jackson turned to Melissa, leaving the decision to her. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her reputation was already compromised by living unchaperoned at the boarding house. One night in a hotel room with separate beds would hardly make it worse. The room was small but clean, with a privacy screen between the 2 narrow beds. Jackson insisted Melissa take the bed farther from the door and politely turned his back while she prepared for sleep, using the screen as additional protection for her modesty. As she lay in the darkness listening to the storm and Jackson's steady breathing, Melissa realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with him. It wasn't just gratitude for his protection or appreciation of his kindness. Somewhere amidst their quiet conversations and shared glances, her heart had recognized something in his that called to her own. Morning brought clear skies and awkward silence as they returned to the boarding house to assess the damage. The kitchen ceiling would need significant repairs, but the rest of the house had weathered the storm. "I'll arrange for carpenters today," Jackson said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thank you," Melissa replied, equally formal. "I should prepare for school." For the next few days, they maintained a careful distance, their easy companionship replaced by stiff politeness. Melissa ached at the loss but didn't know how to bridge the gap her realization had created. The repairs to the boarding house proceeded quickly, and within a week, Mrs. Wallace sent word that she would return in a few days. Their unusual living arrangement would soon end, and Melissa found herself dreading the return to normalcy. One evening, as Jackson prepared to leave after checking the repairs, Melissa gathered her courage. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked. "As a thank you for everything you've done." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." They ate by lamplight, the conversation gradually warming as they fell back into their previous ease. After dinner, they moved to the parlor where Melissa had prepared coffee. "Mrs. Wallace returns tomorrow," she said, handing him a cup. "Yes," Jackson replied, his eyes on the fire. "I'm glad she's coming back. You shouldn't be alone." "I haven't felt alone," Melissa said softly. "Not with you here." His gaze snapped to hers, intense and searching. "Melissa, I know it's not proper," she continued, heart racing. "But I wanted you to know that these days with you have meant a great deal to me." Jackson set down his coffee, his expression pained. "I'm not the man you think I am." "Then who are you?" she asked. "Tell me." He rose, pacing before the fire. "I was married once in Boston." Her name was Catherine. Melissa's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "What happened?" "She died, influenza, 3 years ago." His voice was flat, as if reciting facts from a distant case. "We had a son, he died too, he was 4. Jackson, I'm so sorry." I couldn't save them, he continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. I was a lawyer then. Well-respected, comfortable, but when they died, nothing mattered anymore. I started drinking, gambling. I lost everything. He paused, staring into the flames. A friend who'd gone west wrote to me about needing lawmen in the territories. I figured it was as good a way as any to die. But you didn't die, Melissa said gently. No, he turned to look at her. And then I met you being dragged to that church and something woke up in me. Something I thought was dead and buried with Catherine and William. Hope fluttered in Melissa's chest. What was it? Jackson crossed to her, kneeling before her chair. The desire to protect, to care, he faltered, to love again. Melissa reached out, touching his face with trembling fingers. I love you, Jackson. I know it's happened quickly, but he caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek, not quickly, in its own perfect time. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, as if neither could quite believe it was happening. When they parted, Jackson's eyes were bright with emotion. I can't offer you much, he warned. A sheriff's pay is modest, and I carry scars that may never fully heal. I don't need much, Melissa replied. Just you as you are. The following weeks brought change to Willow Creek. Mrs. Wallace returned, expressing delight at the blossoming romance between Melissa and Jackson. Clarence Rutherford, faced with mounting gambling debts of his own, sold his properties and left for San Francisco. And a letter arrived from Edmund Jones in California, containing a terse apology and the deed to a small parcel of land outside town, Melissa's maternal grandmother's dowry, which he had kept hidden for years. When Jackson proposed in late October, it was at sunset on that very piece of land where they planned to build a home together. Are you certain? He asked, the ring simple but lovely glinting in his palm. My past will always be with me. As will mine, Melissa answered. But our future belongs to us alone. Their wedding in November was everything Melissa's almost wedding had not been, joyful, willing, and true. Reverend Thompson beamed as he pronounced them husband and wife, and the entire town turned out to celebrate. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Jackson whispered in her ear, When I said not today at that church door, I never imagined I'd be saying forever to you instead. Melissa smiled up at him. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms. And sometimes, Jackson replied, drawing her closer, love does too. Spring 1877 brought new life to Willow Creek. The small house Jackson and Melissa built on her grandmother's land was completed just as the first wildflowers appeared. Jackson continued as sheriff, earning a reputation for fairness that spread throughout the territory. Melissa's position at the school became permanent when Miss Andrews left to marry a rancher from a neighboring town. In June, as they sat on their porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Melissa took Jackson's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. We're going to have a baby, she said, watching his expression shift from confusion to wonder. A baby, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Are you certain? Dr. Martin confirmed it yesterday. By Christmas we'll be 3. Jackson gathered her in his arms, tears flowing freely. I never thought I'd have this again, a family, a future. Neither did I, Melissa admitted. When my father was dragging me to that church, I thought my life was over, but it was just beginning. As Melissa's pregnancy progressed, Jackson became both more protective and more reflective. One night, as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her growing belly, he confessed his fears. I couldn't protect them, Catherine and William. What if I fail again? Melissa turned to face him in the darkness. You won't fail, but even if tragedy finds us, we'll face it together. That's the difference. Their son was born on a snowy December night, healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. They named him James, after Jackson's father, with Thomas as a middle name to honor Melissa's grandfather. As Jackson held his son for the first time, the ghosts that had haunted him for so long seemed to recede, not vanishing entirely but taking their proper place in the past. He has your eyes, Melissa observed from the bed, exhausted but radiant. And your fighting spirit, Jackson replied, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped his own. He screamed not today at the world from his first breath, Melissa laughed, like father, like son. By the summer of 1878, Willow Creek had grown considerably. A railroad spur was under construction, promising to connect the town to major lines and bring new prosperity. Jackson had been appointed county sheriff, expanding his jurisdiction and responsibilities. Melissa taught part-time, bringing baby James with her to the delight of her students. On the first anniversary of their wedding, they picnicked on the spot where Jackson had proposed. James crawled on a blanket, exploring the world with determined curiosity while his parents watched adoringly. "Did you ever imagine this?" Melissa asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "When you came west, did you think you'd find happiness again?" Jackson shook his head. "Never. I came looking for oblivion and found redemption instead." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Found you instead." "I'm glad you stood in that doorway," Melissa said. "Glad you said those two words that changed everything." "Not today," Jackson murmured, smiling at the memory. "Best decision I ever made." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Wyoming landscape, they gathered their son and their simple feast, heading home together. The path ahead was uncertain, as all futures are, but they would walk it side by side, a family forged in an act of courage, a love that began with two words and a promise kept. For Melissa and Jackson, the story that started with resistance had transformed into one of enduring love, proof that even in the harsh realities of the Wild West, hearts could find their way home, one to another, against all odds. And in years to come, when their children and grandchildren asked how they met, they would share the tale of a desperate girl, a determined sheriff, and the day that changed everything when fate and courage combined at a church doorway to write a love story neither could have imagined.